Let's discuss the questions for slot 3 verbal CAT 2024. Supposedly, this slot was slightly more difficult than the first two, but of course, the jury is still out on that. This particular question is your usual para-completion question, so this was not a surprise. What we also saw that the order of the blanks was jumbled up, so you had to be a little careful when you were marking the answers. Of course, para-completion questions were MCQs, they were not theta questions, but they were mostly easy. This particular one definitely is. So in this case, we have to read the given sentence, we have to read the paragraph, and we have to figure out where the given sentence will best fit. Fairly simple task. Many have had to leave their homes behind, with more than 1.3 million people being displaced due to the drought. What I need to know from the given sentence is that it is talking about people being displaced. So I should connect it with some other sentence that is also talking about displacement due to drought. Now, as we read the paragraph, the first sentence introduces the topic. It says Somalia has been dealing with an enormous humanitarian catastrophe driven by the longest and the most severe drought the country has experienced in at least 40 years. So we know that there is a severe drought in Somalia. The sentence after blank 1 says, 5 consecutive rainy seasons have failed. Now, the moment I read this, I'm thinking, okay, we're still talking about how long and severe the drought is. So I don't really see a logical gap that I need to fill, which means blank 1, which in some cases would have been presented as option 4, is not the answer. There is absolutely no reason for us to put in another additional sentence in the middle because both the statements are discussing the severity of the drought. There is nothing that talks about displacement so far. As we read further, it says more than 8 million people, almost half of the country's population, have experienced acute food insecurity. Now, right after we mention acute food insecurity, it kind of makes sense to discuss how a lot of people may have starved or perhaps lost their lives. So after blank 2, we're saying more than 43,000 people are believed to have lost their lives, with half of the lives lost likely being children under 5. So if there is acute food shortage, then yes, it is likely that a lot of people will die. So far, again, we're not talking about displacement. We're talking about how lack of food has led to loss of lives, which means that just like option 1, option 2 is also not going to be our answer because there is no connection with displacement so far. Now let's move on to the third blank. Here we are saying that the damage the drought has caused is far-reaching. So we've already talked about the shortage of food, the loss of lives, and now we're talking about further consequences. Farmers have lost all their agricultural income, while pastoralists have lost more than 3 million livestock. So apart from loss of lives, there have been economic consequences as well. Again, blank 3 should be left blank because we are talking about the economic consequences of the drought, but so far again, there is no mention of displacement. But when we start talking about pastoralists, we may or may not understand, but that should not really detract you from getting to the answer because the very next sentence is going to help you out. So far, however, since there has been no mention of displacement, we say that option 3 or blank 3 is not the answer. Now, we have only one more to go. Right after blank 4, we have said some, like the pastoralists, may never be able to go back as their livelihoods have been irreversibly wiped out. This is a very important sentence because it says that some may not be able to go back. When would you go back to a place? When you've had to leave the place. Finally, there is some connection to the idea of displacement. So the moment I read the last sentence, I should say, okay, now I know the answer. The answer has to be blank 4, which in this case is actually presented as the third option. So we can be pretty sure that we've gotten the answer right to this question, and that is why I said that this is an easy question to begin with. Now here we are looking at an odd sentence question. As you can see, it tells you that there are 5 statements related to a topic. 4 of them can be put together to form a coherent paragraph. We have to identify the odd one out. As usual, we're not actually going to form the entire sequence like in a parajumble. What we'll do is that we will read each statement, we will try to reduce it to a few words, in other words, apply a short label to it. Using these labels, we will try to see what the big picture is overall, what is the theme, what is that paragraph talking about, and then we will see if we can figure out the odd sentence. Now, this is not a very easy paragraph to read because of the topic. It talks about neurons and synapses and fetal connections. So there are a lot of complicated words thrown in. However, if you keep your patience just a little bit, you'll realize that it's a pretty easy question to solve. It looks difficult, but is not. So let's get started. The first statement says, to create a synapse, the neuron has specialized structures seen as tiny swellings at the terminal end of the axon, where it stores chemicals that are emitted to transmit a signal to the next neuron. Now, what are we talking about? Two things here. Synapse and something to do with the structure of a neuron. So, I'm not going to get into too many details here because this is just presenting a fact. It's not really a viewpoint, it's not an argument. So, let's just stick to the basics and say, okay, this has to do with neuronal structure and synapse formation. Now, the second statement starts off by saying this fetal warm-up act. When we read this, we might wonder, what is fetal? So, fetal is the adjective form of fetus. Before a baby is born, we call it a fetus. Now, let's not again get into technicalities here. Let's just imagine that we're talking about the time before the baby is born. So, even before the baby is born, there is some sort of a warm-up happening. Warm-up is preparation. So, the baby is preparing to do something. According to statement 2, it is preparing to see the world. How do I know that? Because it says that the fetal warm-up act, the soldering of neural connections before the eyes actually function, is crucial to the performance of the visual system. So, there has to be a warm-up before the child is born in order for the visual system to function. So, the baby is preparing to see the world, and this has something to do with the neural connections. So, again, without getting into too much technical details, all that we are talking about is that fetal neural connections are actually important to the performance of the visual system. They're important for the baby to be able to see after it is born. The third statement says, the reasons for this paring back of synapses is a mystery. Even if you don't understand what paring back is, it's okay because it's explained later. Synaptic pruning is thought to sharpen and reinforce the correct synapses while removing the weak and unnecessary ones. So here again, we are talking about some sort of connection between neurons, and we are trying to say that some connections are gotten rid of and some good connections are kept. And this is what synaptic pruning is. Pruning is to cut down, reduce. Normally, we use it in the context of, say, gardening. But here, when we talk about pruning, we are basically saying we get rid of the weak synapses and we keep the good ones. That's it. The fourth statement, again, is very similar to the second one. Neural connections between the eyes and the brain are formed long before birth, establishing the wiring and the circuitry that allow a child to begin visualizing the world the minute she emerges from the womb. So, that's exactly what we were saying in the second statement also, that the wiring or the warm-up has to all be in place before the child actually is born, which means that 2 and 4 are definitely connected. We're talking about fetal connections for vision. The fifth statement talks about a rehearsal period. So this also we should be able to connect to 2, right? But otherwise also if you read 5, it says the synapses, which are points of chemical connection between nerve cells, are generated in excess only to be pruned back during later development. So this can be connected to the point about synaptic pruning in 3, which means that we already know our theme. Our theme has to do with what happens in the fetus brain before it is born. Basically, we need to prepare to see the world before we actually can see the world. So, if I identify my theme really well, it will sound something like this: development and refinement of neural connections for vision before birth. There is only one statement that does not talk about how our system prepares to see the world, which is statement 1. And that is why that is clearly going to be your answer. What has happened here is that while it does talk about synapses and neurons, it does not form any connection to how it helps us see the world. Whereas we clearly can connect 2 and 4. We can also connect 3 and 5, but there is nothing we can connect 1 to. So even if you decide to form links and do this question, your answer should still be the same, which is option 1. Now, this here is a pretty difficult summary question. The reason that I'm saying it's difficult is on 2 accounts. First, it's difficult to understand. Secondly, the options are really, really close. So honestly, if I were doing this in the test, I would choose to probably skip this one. Nevertheless, let's try our best to figure out why the answer is what it is. The paragraph is talking about someone called the Tradwife. Now, even if you don't really understand what Tradwife means, by reading the paragraph, you would probably think that it is a traditional wife, and that in fact is exactly what it is. Traditional wife, as the name suggests, is a woman who probably prefers the traditional gender roles where the lady stays at home and takes care of the home and the children, and the man is the breadwinner. So here it is talking about what the Tradwife does and how it probably provokes outrage in the modern world because we think it's pretty regressive, it's too old-fashioned. But let's go into a little bit more detail. When the Tradwife puts on that Georgic pinstripe dress, she's not just admiring the visual cues of a fantastical past. She takes these dreams of storybook bliss literally, tracing them backward in time until she reaches a logical conclusion that satisfies her. Now, this part honestly is very difficult to understand in detail, but we are basically trying to say here that the Tradwife presents a particular image. She dresses in a particular way, vintage clothing, that is what a pinstripe dress is. And she's also taking these stories literally. So some of our old stories are pretty old-fashioned. They talk about domestic bliss. Now, we know them to be stories, but the Tradwife takes the stories literally, and she wants to replicate that entire storybook in life. So, by doing so, she ends up delivering an unhappy reminder of just how much of our lives consist of artifice and play acting. So, what is she doing? She is acting out a story. And why is she acting out a story? Because it satisfies her belief system. That is what makes sense to her. But in doing that, she's also reminding us that our lives are artificial. We act a lot of times. The word artifice again has to do with artificiality. Then it says the Tradwife outrages people because of her deliberately regressive ideals. So when we see someone like that in today's day and age, a lot of us with slightly more modern beliefs will say, oh, but that is so old-fashioned and that is so anti-feminist and so on. And that is exactly what the outrage is about. So when I read this paragraph, I would mentally break it down into 2 parts. The first part is about the Tradwife and how by dressing in a particular way, by assuming certain traditional gender roles, she provokes outrage. That becomes my first point, which is X. After that, it says, and yet her behavior is on some level indistinguishable from the non-Tradwives. Now, this point is slightly confusing, right? How is a traditional wife similar to a non-traditional wife? And then we look at the second part of the argument. The Tradwife's trollish genius is to beat us at our own dress-up game by insisting that the idyllic cottage daydream should be real, right down to the primitive gender roles. She leaves others feeling hollow and cheated. What are we really saying? That somehow the traditional wife is reminding us that our lives are also all about acting, that they are not really as genuine and as true as we would like them to be. And that is how this traditional wife is beating us at our own game. She is acting out some sort of a storybook. We are also acting out a completely different story of our own making. And in that way, the Tradwife is very similar to the non-Tradwife. We are both play acting. Now, this is about showing us how the Tradwife not only outrages us, but also makes us feel hollow and disillusioned by pointing to the fact that we're not very different from her. Now, this is pretty deep understanding. Would I get so much in depth while reading the question? No. This took about 10 readings for me to get so far. And even now, I think I've missed out on a few things. After this, however, the options do not make life easy for us. Let's take a look at the options. The first one says, by promoting an idealized past, the Tradwife exposes the artifice of contemporary values and mocks societal norms. Now, I would probably have an issue with this option because the Tradwife is not deliberately mocking societal norms. By acting in a particular way, the Tradwife is a reminder that our lives are also pretty artificial. But I would eliminate option 1 primarily because there is no deliberate attempt to mock. So I would say, okay, option 1 may not be the answer. Option 2, however, very different story. The Tradwife, with her vintage dress and traditional roles, highlights the superficiality of modern life and challenges current societal norms. Now, the word superficial is pretty important because that's exactly what the Tradwife is doing. She is highlighting how our lives are also pretty fake. And she is also challenging the current societal norms by pointing out, you know what, you're as fake as I am. So option 2 we would probably keep. The third one says the Tradwife's vintage dress and adherence to traditional roles reveal the artificial nature of modern life and its superficial values. As far as I can see, 2 and 3 are very similar. So I would say, okay, let's keep option 3 as well. Now let's go to the fourth option. The Tradwife's commitment to outdated gender roles and retro fashion critiques the superficiality of today's societal ideals. Again, just like mock, I would probably have an issue with the word critique. But other than that, also there is another problem with the fourth one. It is not her commitment to gender roles and retro fashion that critiques the superficiality of today's societal ideals. It is the Tradwife and displaying her commitment to all of these things that shows us that our lives are also fake, just like hers. So there is a very, very small difference really if you think about it. It is not the outdated gender role or the retro fashion that is a reminder of how fake our lives are. It is the Tradwife and all of these things that she encompasses. So ultimately, I get rid of option 4. But we're still stuck between 2 and 3. Now, honestly, at this point, I would not be able to choose between the two or the second or the third option. What I would say is that, again, it is not the vintage dress and the adherence to traditional roles that is the problem. It is the Tradwife and the show that she puts on that is the problem. So between 2 and 3, that is the only difference that I see. There is, of course, another difference as well. 2 talks about how the Tradwife challenges current societal norms. 3 does not really mentions that. It talks about superficial values. So yes, modern life is artificial and some of our values might be superficial, but who is challenging that? Is it the vintage dress and the traditional roles? No, it is the Tradwife. So between 2 and 3, I would say 2 is more grammatically accurate. I would eliminate 3 and say 2 is probably a better answer. Here we have an odd sentence question. So we'll solve it as usual. We will read each statement. We will try to simplify it or reduce it to fewer words. Overall, identify what the theme is and then see what the odd sentence is. I think, again, it's a pretty easy question if you're able to see the big picture. If you're trying it the parajumble way, then I'm not sure whether it is easy or difficult because I didn't try it that way at all. It wasn't necessary. Let's look at the first statement. Part of the appeal of forecasting is not just that it seems to work, but that you don't need to seem specialized expertise to succeed at it. So we're talking about forecasting and we're saying that on the whole, you don't need specialized expertise to forecast. What is forecast? To predict. So that is all that I need to write down for the first statement. The second statement says that the tight connection between forecasting and building a model of the world explains why a lot of the early interest in the idea came from the intelligence community. So here we're trying to say that somehow there is a connection between forecasting and building a model of the world, and that is why the intelligence community was interested in forecasting. Moving on to the third statement. This was true even though the latter had access to classified intelligence. Now, we don't really know who the latter are right now, but all I will say is that someone had access to classified intelligence. This sentence we will have to connect to something else later on, but we'll come back to it. The fourth statement talks about a study. This study found that accurate forecasters' prediction of geopolitical events were more accurate than forecasts of members of the US intelligence community who answered the same questions in a confidential prediction market. So, A simplified version here is that forecasters' predictions were actually more accurate as compared to similar predictions made by the US intelligence. Now, this connects with the first statement. The first sentence, if you remember, said that expertise is not essential to forecasting. The study mentioned in statement 4 supports that idea also. Now, if I go back to 3 kind of makes sense. The latter would obviously refer to the US intelligence community. The US intelligence community had access to classified intelligence, and yet their predictions were not as great as the forecasters' predictions. Moving on to statement 5, the aggregated opinions of non-experts doing forecasting have proven to be a better guide to the future than aggregated opinions of experts. So again, we're going back to the idea that non-experts are actually better at making predictions than experts. So that is our overall theme. Accuracy of non-experts in forecasting is usually better than the experts' predictions. Once we have understood this, it's very easy to get to the answer. See, the first one or the first statement is talking about how expertise is not important to forecasting. The second one talks about the link between forecasting and modeling the world, which is pretty out of scope, right? Because none of the other statements have talked about modeling the world. Yes, it does mention the intelligence community, but it doesn't give us a comparison between experts and non-experts. So I would start thinking 2 is probably the odd one out. The third one, we were able to connect to statement 4, so then it makes sense. And 4th and 5th are clearly saying that non-experts are better than the experts in this case being people from the US intelligence community. So our answer would have to be option 2. This passage is argumentative, but it's pretty easy to understand because the language is fairly simple. In the first paragraph, the author says that there is a group of people who would like to protect space from harmful contamination. But look at the last sentence of the first paragraph. That is where you will sense the author's point of view. Under this regime, what is this regime? All those who require us to protect celestial bodies from contamination. So under this regime or this view, NASA incurs great expense sterilizing robotic probes in order to prevent the contamination of entirely theoretical biospheres. So when we say that something is a biosphere, it means that it sustains life. But the author is saying that these biospheres are theoretical. In other words, there isn't really any life that we have found. By the time we get to the second paragraph, we realize that the author is simply saying that we are not, or rather there's no need for us to make so much effort to prevent contamination because there is no life that we have found out there. So look at paragraph 2. It says nobody wants to expose Martians to measles, but sadly robotic explorations reveals a bleak, rusted landscape lacking oxygen and flooded with radiation ready to sterilize any earthly microbes. So in any case, the atmosphere there is so harsh that it will probably kill any microbes that we bring there from Earth. Then we are saying that yes, simple life might exist, but it's been very hard to find with robots. In other words, we have not really found any life on Mars. Since life on Mars is a purely hypothetical possibility, therefore, should we be making so much effort to protect these life forms from contamination? And the author is trying to say that it doesn't really make sense. In the last sentence, the author says, the upsides from human exploration and development of Mars clearly outweigh the welfare of purely speculative Martian fungi. So basically, we have not found any life on Mars, so whom are we trying to protect? And is it really worth the effort? Ultimately, the author is saying, no, it's not. So the topic of this passage clearly is human exploration of space and planetary protection. And the author is trying to say that all of these strict planetary protection measures which are aimed at preventing harmful contamination of celestial bodies, they're not really necessary. Let's move on to paragraph number 3. Now, in paragraph 3, we're extending the author's argument, but we're talking about human exploration of other celestial bodies, for example, the moon and asteroids. Now, very similar to Mars, the author is arguing that the environment out there is also pretty harsh and it is very unlikely that any life will survive. But the other argument that the author is making in paragraph 3 is that even if we take measures to prevent contamination of celestial bodies, other countries may not necessarily do that. For example, China recently sent a terrarium to the moon and germinated a plant seed with no protest from its own scientific community. In contrast, when Israel did something similar, there was a firestorm that was unleashed within the space community. So, in different countries, the scientific community has a very different attitude to planetary protection. So, even if we take these measures to protect these planets, other countries may not. So, ultimately, remember, the author is trying to argue that there is really no need for us to make so much effort. So, what are the two reasons? The harsh environments on these celestial bodies are anyway likely to kill the contaminants. Secondly, other countries such as China might disregard all such measures. In paragraph 4, we are adding to the argument. Here we are saying that NASA's previous human exploration efforts made no serious attempt at sterility. Sterility here means keeping the environment clean and contamination free. As the Mars expert Robert Zubrin noted in the National Review, US lunar landings did not leave the campsites cleaner than they found. So, we are adding on to the existing argument by saying that, look, in the past, we really did not make such effort. So, why are we trying to do that now? And in fact, if we try to do that now, it's going to make things very complicated for NASA. It would destroy NASA's human exploration budget and encroach on the agency's other directorates too. Getting future astronauts off Mars is enough of a challenge without trying to tote weeks of waste along as well. So, we're trying to again say that, look, in the past, we didn't have to make such effort. And on the whole, no one raised a hue and cry about it. So now, do we really need to add to the challenges that NASA already has to face? So for example, if we send astronauts to Mars, we would obviously first try to get the astronauts there and back safely without having to worry about lugging back all the waste as well. Let's look at the next paragraph. Now here, the author is suggesting a compromise. A reasonable compromise is to continue on the course laid out by the US government and the National Research Council. What is the solution? A system of zones on Mars, some for only science, some for habitation, some for resource exploitation. This approach minimizes contamination, maximizes scientific exploration, and then the author is making a wider argument that Mars is an opportunity for us. And then, what is this opportunity? Because in the future, apart from the fact that we have Earth, what if we are not able to inhabit Earth anymore? Then what are the other choices that we have? Alternatively, we can choose to propel our biosphere further into the solar system, simultaneously protecting our home planet and providing a backup plan for the only life we know exists in the universe. In other words, human life is pretty valuable. Our lives on Earth worth less than some hypothetical microbe lurking under Martian rocks. So, you have to understand what the author is saying. The author is saying, yes, we'll make some effort, let's come up with a compromise. We don't want to go and contaminate all of Mars. But at the same time, let's keep in mind the fact that Mars presents an opportunity for humanity. And let's not ignore that opportunity because we are trying to protect some hypothetical fungi or bacteria on Mars which have not even been discovered. So, if I have to sum up the argument, the author is recommending a balanced approach to Mars exploration with different zones for different activities, and this will also offer a way to protect Earth and also provide other avenues for exploration of space. Now that we've read the passage, let's do a very quick passage recap and then we'll take a look at the questions. So in the first two paragraphs, we talked about how stringent planetary protection measures, which are aimed at preventing contamination of celestial environments, are excessive. They're not really necessary. Then we said that in any case, the environments in space and on such celestial bodies is pretty harsh and therefore is likely to kill anything. Plus, other countries may disregard all such protection measures. After that, we argued that imposing strict sterility and waste management requirements would probably be financially and logistically impractical for NASA. And if you remember, we also made the argument that in the past, we didn't really try to do such things. And then finally, the author said, okay, let's approach it in a somewhat balanced way. We can have designated zones for different activities on Mars, but we still need to continue with our exploration of Mars because it's an opportunity that humanity cannot ignore. So all in all, the author is trying to tell us that very strict planetary protection measures for Mars exploration specifically are impractical. And what we need is a balanced approach that also furthers human life and possibilities to live on other planets such as Mars. So let's now look at the questions. The author's overall tone in the first paragraph can be described as. Now, this question is pretty special because in the last few years in CAT, we haven't really seen any tone questions. In fact, we didn't really see tone questions in the other two slots either. Luckily, however, this is an easy tone question. So if you remember, a good way to approach tone questions is to simply think about whether the author's tone is neutral, positive, or negative. Now, since this is an argumentative passage, on the whole, the author's tone is not going to be neutral. The author will either argue for something or the author will argue against something. So, what is the author really trying to say? If you look at the first paragraph, last line, when we say that NASA incurs great expense sterilizing robotic probes in order to prevent the contamination of entirely theoretical biospheres, we are really trying to argue here that such strict planetary protection measures are not really necessary. So this we have to understand before we can start looking at the options. So our shadow answer will look something like this, that the author disapproves of such planetary protection measures. Not completely, but the author definitely thinks we don't have to put in so much effort. Now our first option says, approving of the amount of money NASA spends to restrict the spread of contamination in space. Most of us would agree that this is an easy option to eliminate because the author thinks that we should not be spending such exorbitant amounts because it might make it impractical to explore space in the long run. So option 1 is out. Option 2 says, equivocal about the reasons extended by the group of scientists seeking to limit space exploration. Now, what I've found is that if you just look at the first word in every option, it makes life very simple. But you have to understand what the first word is. Equivocal means unclear, that you're not very sure of how you feel, or at least you're not making those feelings very clear to the reader. But the author is in fact very clear. From the very first paragraph, the author seems to suggest that these theoretical biospheres we are trying to protect are not really worth that much care as people are asking. So, the author is not equivocal. The author is saying we don't need to make so much effort. So, let's eliminate 2. The third one, skeptical about the excessive efforts to sanitize planets where life has not yet been proven to exist. This is something that the last line does support. The word skeptical means doubtful. And the author is saying that since these biospheres are theoretical, we haven't really found life, whom are we trying to protect? So yes, the author is questioning our efforts to protect these biospheres. Let's keep option 3. Now, the fourth one says, indifferent to the elitism of a few scientists aiming to corner space exploration. Now, if you look at the first sentence, it says as a group in the space community who view the solar system not as an opportunity to expand human potential, but as a nature preserve forever the provenance of an elite group of scientists. So basically, these people, they think of space as a lab in a way. It's not really an opportunity to expand opportunities for humans. It's like a laboratory and therefore should be kept clean and sterilized. And the author is clearly not in favor of this view. The author is saying that, look, space presents an opportunity for humanity and we should take that opportunity. So the author is not indifferent, because the word indifferent means that the author does not have any feelings on the matter. The author clearly is opposed to such elitism as far as we can see. So option 4 is gone. Our answer will have to be option 3. Now, let's look at this question. The author is unlikely to disagree with any of the following except. Now, there are 3 words that we need to pay attention to: unlikely, disagree, and accept. I would say that there are 3 negative words, right? Unlikely is a negative word, disagree is a negative word, and accept is also a negative word because it's kind of like saying not. Now, if we have 3 negatives, what do? We cancel out 2 of them and keep 1. So our simplified question is something like this. The author is likely to disagree with which of the following? So we need to find something that the author will disagree with. Now that that is clear, let's take a look at our options. The first option says, space contamination should be minimized until the possibility of life on the astronomical body being explored is ruled out. So this option is telling us that, you know what, we need to be very, very careful until we actually find life. But the author is not really saying that. If you look at the text in paragraph 2, the author is saying, yes, we don't deliberately want to do any harm to the Martians, but come on, we haven't really found them. And even if there are some Martian fungi hidden somewhere, are we actually going to let them hold sway over the upsides of human exploration and development of Mars? So let's focus on humanity. Let's not worry about them so much, particularly since we've not found them. Now, in paragraph 3 also, the author is clearly saying that the other likely targets of human exploration would probably kill everything because they're very harsh environments. So, according to the author, it's very unlikely that we will find life, plus we haven't found it. So, we should not hold off on our efforts until we find such life, which means that option 1 is something that the author will disagree with. Space contamination should not be minimized. The author thinks that all these efforts are excessive since we haven't really found any life. And the author does not suggest that we hold out until we find such life. Now remember, the author is likely to disagree with which of the following. I would say option 1 looks pretty good, so we keep it. Option 2 says the exorbitant costs of continuing to keep the space environment pristine may be unsustainable. This, in fact, has explicit support in the passage. If you look at paragraph 4, forcing NASA's proposed Mars exploration to do better and keeping everything clean would destroy NASA's human exploration budget. So clearly, the costs of such pristine exploration will be very high and therefore unsustainable. So the author would agree with option 2, which means this cannot be our answer. We are looking for something the author would disagree with. Option 3 says the proposal for a zonal segregation of Martian landscape into regions for different purposes. This we have again found very clearly stated in the last paragraph. A reasonable compromise is to continue on the course with a proposed system of zones on Mars, some for science, some for habitation, some for resource exploitation. So the author is in complete agreement with option 3, which means it can't be our answer. Option 4 says, while NASA's earlier missions were not ideal in their approach to space contamination, they likely did no grave damage. Now let's look at the text very carefully. In paragraph 4, we are talking about earlier NASA missions. It says that they made no serious attempt at sterility. They did not really try to keep celestial environments clean with little notice. At that time, no one really paid attention. And the passage does not say this, but come on, at that time, the fact that we were actually able to send someone to the moon or send someone in space itself was a big deal. So we were not too worried about cleanliness of space. But the author is now saying that the lunar landings did not leave the campsites cleaner than they found it. But at that time, no one really noticed it. And so far, we have not really found any problems as a result of it. So option 4 is something that the author is likely to agree with. Again, we can't be absolutely sure that they did no grave damage, but look at the wordings. They likely did no grave damage. And when the author says that NASA's previous efforts made no serious attempt at sterility with little notice, it means probably nothing bad happened. So option 4, again, the author would agree with, which means we go back to option 1. As I said, the author is not in favor of so much effort at keeping space contamination minimal because the author feels that there's no need for it. Therefore, option 1 is our answer. Now, this is a pretty simple question. The contrasting reactions to the Chinese and Israeli contaminations of lunar space. After that, it's open-ended. So what I would do is I would look at the text, obviously, and figure out in what context these contrasting reactions have been mentioned. So the author has said, it is also important to note that many international competitors will ignore the demands of these protection extremists in any case. And then the author has used the example of China versus Israel. Now, when China sprouted a seed on moon, or rather carried a terrarium to the moon, no one really protested in the Chinese scientific community. But when Israel smuggled super resilient microscopic tardigrades aboard the ill-fated Israeli Bereshit lunar probe, there was a firestorm that was unleashed. So in Israel, many people got upset. In China, no one got upset. Why has the author mentioned both of these examples? The answer is given to us just before the examples. That international competitors, in some cases, are going to ignore these demands for planetary protection. So let's keep this in mind. My shadow answer is something like this, that scientists in different countries may react differently to concerns about planetary protection. China, not very concerned. Israel, apparently very concerned. Let's look at our options. Indicate that national scientists may have different sensitivities to the issues of biosphere protection. That's exactly what these examples illustrate. In Israel, apparently scientists made a hue and cry about it. But in China, no one really did. So let's keep option 1. Option 2 says that the contrasting reactions are valid because the contamination of the lunar environment from animal sources is far greater than from plants. Now, all options that contain a comparison anyway, we should double check. This is not mentioning whether the contamination from animal sources is more or whether plant sources is more. So clearly option 2 is completely out of scope. Let's eliminate it. The contrasting reactions are evidence of China's reasonable approach towards space contamination. The author is not supporting Israel's approach or China's approach. All that the author is trying to point out is that not everyone is going to respond the same way. So we cannot say that China's approach is reasonable. Therefore, option 3 cannot be our answer. Option 4 says, reveal global biases prevalent in attitude towards different countries. So when the author gives the example of China, it is not to say, oh, the Chinese will naturally react that way because the Chinese are like that. The author is merely trying to say that some international competitors will ignore the demands for these protection extremists or ignore the demands for planetary protection. And then the author gives us the example of China. But it is merely a statement of fact. It is not to reveal any biases towards any country. And therefore, option 4 cannot be the answer. So please remember that in all such questions where it is asking you why something has been mentioned in the passage, the answer is often given to you just before or after the text. All we need to do is read a little before these examples and we'll get our answer straight away, which in this case is option 1. Now here we have an except question. The author mentions all of the following reasons to dismiss concerns about contaminating Mars except. So let's keep in mind that we need to pick something that has not been mentioned as a reason to dismiss concerns about contamination. Something that has not been mentioned as a reason to not contaminate Mars. Now, the first option says the use of similar probes on astronomical bodies like the moon have had little effect on the environment. Now, if you remember, in the past, we looked at a question which had very similar options. So, I'm not really sure if you remember, but you need to always go back to the text to double check. When we say little effect, it means almost no effect. But is the author saying that there was almost no effect? It says that when NASA previously went to the moon, it did not leave the campsite cleaner than they found it. So they did pollute or contaminate the campsite. So we can't say that it did not have too much of an impact on the environment. It did contaminate the environment a little more than if humans had never gone there. So I would say that option 1 has not been mentioned as a reason to dismiss concerns about contaminating Mars. It has simply been mentioned as a fact. So let's keep option 1 on hold. Option 2 says earlier explorations have already contaminated pristine space environments. Now, if we look at the same text, this is what the text is actually trying to explain to us. That when NASA sent missions to the moon, they obviously spread some trash around. So earlier explorations did not make any attempt to keep space environments clean. And this was not really noticed too much in the sense that people did not pay attention to this. So, since we did not really take so much care in the past, all of a sudden, why is it so important for us to keep space clean now? Which means 2 has been mentioned as a reason to dismiss concerns about contaminating Mars. The author is saying that, it's okay, let's not worry so much about contamination because in the past we did not. So option 2 is not an exception. Let's eliminate it. Option 3 says the lack of evidence of living organisms on Mars makes possible contamination from earthly microbes a moot point. This is very clearly stated in paragraph 2. It says that we don't really want to pollute Mars. For example, we don't want to expose Martians to measles. But the fact is that we haven't really found any life there. And since we don't have any evidence of life on Mars, do we really need to worry about contaminating Mars? So option 3 has also been mentioned as a reason why we should not worry about contaminating Mars. It's okay because there's no one there who will probably be harmed, which means this is not an exception. Let's eliminate it. The fourth option says, efforts to contain contamination on Mars are likely to be derailed as competitor countries may not follow similar restrictions. This, in fact, has also been mentioned. Paragraph 3. Many international competitors will ignore the demands of these protection extremists in any case. So, even if some countries are trying to keep space and these planets clean, other countries may not really want to. So ultimately, will we be able to keep Mars clean? Not really. And then the author has taken the example of China. So option 4 again has been mentioned as a reason why we should not worry about contaminating Mars. Let's eliminate it. Now, please remember, option 1 is an exception not because there is no reference to it. Yes, there is a reference to it, but it is factually incorrect. The author is not trying to say that similar probes on astronomical bodies have had little effect on the environment. When NASA sent a mission to the moon, we did leave the campsite a little dirtier. But this is not mentioned as a reason why we cannot contaminate Mars or why we should not really worry about contaminating Mars. So, option 1 therefore is our answer. Here we have a really interesting passage on some Chinese liquor. So it says that Moutai has been the global booze sensation of the decade. A bottle of its Flying Fairy sold in the 1980s for about $1, but now it retails for $400. So on the whole, the passage promises to be fairly simple because we're going to be talking about the success of Moutai. Why is it so popular and why has this brand become so successful? Paragraph 2, however, says that the success of Moutai goes against every Western marketing mantra. It is not global, it has meager digital sales, and it does not appeal to millennials. So basically what it is implying is that most companies in the West would be trying to accomplish some sort of a global presence. They would definitely be focusing on digital sales and they would definitely try to reach out to millennials, right? But Moutai has not done any of that. It scores pitifully on environmental, social and governance measures. Again, something that companies in the West would probably try and do. In the Boy Scout world of Western business, it would leave a bad taste in more ways than one. So now we sense that this company is doing something that is generally going to be seen in a negative light in the Western world. But that's all we know. So what has contributed to the success of Moutai? We don't really know, but we do know that the success has nothing to do with Western principles of marketing. Now moving on to paragraph 3. This is finally when the author starts explaining why the company or the brand has been so successful. Moutai owes its intoxicating success to 3 factors, not all of them easy to emulate. In other words, other companies probably will not be able to accomplish this. First, it profits from Chinese nationalism. Now, we know that nationalism is some sort of a connection to one's country, somewhat similar to patriotism, but not entirely. It says that it's basically a national brand. It's centuries-old craftsmanship. It is distilled 8 times, stored for years in earthenware jars. It is a source of national pride. So people view this particular company as a source of pride. Now, when we view something as a source of pride, obviously that is going to promote that company. It also claims to be hangover-proof, which would make it an invention to rival gunpowder. Now, this last line is pretty important because later on there's a question about it, but we have to understand what this is saying overall. We're trying to say that if in fact it is hangover-proof, then that's a pretty big deal because then this product is equal to or nearly equal to gunpowder, which in its time was also a pretty big deal, of course, for very different reasons. So overall, this paragraph is trying to say that Moutai owes its success to 3 factors, one of which is Chinese nationalism, the fact that people feel pride in Moutai. The second factor has been detailed in paragraph 4. It chose to serve China's super rich rather than its middle class. Now, I believe that a lot of us feel that the middle class is obviously the largest chunk of the consumers and therefore we should definitely try to target the middle class. But this company is going in a completely different direction. Markets are littered with the corpses of firms that could not compete in the cutthroat battle for Chinese middle class wallets. So, when you're trying to target the middle class, there's a lot of competition. But in the country's premium market, there are a lot of people. Now, let's consider that we're talking about China here. So, even if we say that the elite form maybe 2% or 5% of the population, that's still a lot of people because, again, it's China. It says that it is massive at 73 million strong, bigger than the population of France. So they still have a lot of people that they can cater to. Moutai is to these well-heeled drinkers what vintage champagne is to the rest of the world. So it's a premium brand. So the argument here, of course, is that the second reason that Moutai has succeeded is that it has chosen to cater to the super rich or the elite of Chinese society. And now we look at the third reason. Moutai looks beyond affluent millennials and digital natives. So if it's not really focusing on millennials, whom is it focusing on? The elderly and the middle-aged. Apparently, this age group can be just as lucrative. Its biggest market right now is male drinkers in their mid-30s. Many have no siblings, which allows their parents to spend a lot of money on their weddings. And in the wedding, what do they spend money on? Of course, Moutai. It is the guest of honor. So ultimately, cultural factors are also contributing to the success of Moutai. The fact that they are choosing to target the slightly older consumer group has contributed to their success. So now we know all the things that have contributed to Moutai's success. Now, paragraphs 6 and 7 are leading us into a slightly different direction. It says that it has succeeded thanks to nationalism, elitism, remember it's targeting the super rich or the elite, and ageism. Ageism is nothing but targeting the older age groups. In other words, not in spite of this unholy trinity. So, normally, if a company adopted these strategies, it would not do well. That is why we are calling it the unholy trinity. But in this case, the same factors have contributed to the success of Moutai. But it faces risks. The government is the largest stakeholder and it is a meddlesome one, which means that there is some degree of government interference, particularly with regard to prices. Because Moutai is very, very expensive, the government may not be very happy about it because exorbitantly priced booze is at odds with professed socialist ideals. Again, this may or may not be sincerely stated in the passage, but let's not go into that. Yet, minority investors, including many foreign funds, lament that Moutai's wholesale price is a third of what it sells for in shops. So, obviously, people have different opinions on what Moutai can actually make in terms of profits. The government wants to keep the prices reasonable or stable. So, that's one problem. Other than that, in the long run, its biggest risk may be millennials. As they grow older, health concerns, work-life balance, and the desire for more wholesome pursuits than binge drinking may curb the toasting culture or the heavy drinking culture. Now, if you remember, Moutai is targeting a particular age group, and the current culture in China is kind of working for the company because there are a lot of men in their 30s and their parents are willing to spend a lot of money on their weddings. Therefore, Moutai has a pretty big market. But ultimately, people will grow older. And when they're older, they may not necessarily want to binge drink. And if they don't want to binge drink, then who is really going to want to spend $400 on a bottle of liquor? So, these are the risks that the company faces. But that's it. That's where the passage ends. Ultimately, we're trying to say that yes, it has achieved remarkable success, but Moutai faces risk from primarily two factors, or three rather: government interference, changing consumer habits, and changing societal values, which may happen in the future. Let's do a very quick recap and then we'll look at the questions. Now, in the first two paragraphs, we said that Moutai has achieved remarkable success while disregarding Western marketing principles. It has done pretty much everything that a Western company would not really do. But then we said it owes its success to three factors, of which the first one is Chinese nationalism. Remember, it's a national brand, people take pride in it and so on. The second factor is that it is choosing to cater to the rich or the elite of China rather than the middle class, where there would have been a lot more competition. But in this super rich group, there isn't enough competition. There aren't as many premium brands. So the company therefore has it slightly easier. And then the third factor is that it actually targets the elderly and the middle-aged consumers. If you remember the way Chinese society is structured currently, there are a lot of men in their 30s and their parents are willing to spend money on their weddings, and therefore Moutai has a very big market. Now, finally, we said that yes, it has achieved success, but there are some risks from government interference, changing habits of consumers, and possibly changing societal values in the future as well. But ultimately, this paragraph is pretty much just descriptive. It is telling us about the success of Moutai, and it is also saying what drives this success. Nationalism, exclusivity, and targeting older demographics. At the same time, it faces risks from government interference and shifting consumer habits. So, as I said, very easy to read passage. Let's take a look at the questions, which I also believe are on the simpler side. Which one of the following is both a reason for Moutai's success as well as a possible threat to that success? Now, this has to be something that works both ways. There are two options here that are slightly confusing, so we will discuss them. But let's take a look at our first option. It's appeal to the older age group. This is true, right? Moutai is deliberately not trying to target millennials. It is trying to appeal to the middle-aged and the elderly. So why is it trying to do that? Because of the way Chinese society is structured. But look at paragraph 6 and 7. In paragraph 6, we have said that Moutai has succeeded due to nationalism, elitism, and ageism. It is targeting specific age groups. But in the long run, one of these factors is actually going to work against it. Which one? Millennials. Millennials are going to get older. They may not necessarily want to keep drinking at the same pace that they do now, and as a result, Moutai may not be as popular. So, because it is currently targeting a particular age group, it may not be able to continually sell to the same age group because their habits will change. So, the older age group is a source of risk. Let's keep option 1. The second one, Chinese love of liquor-filled celebration. Yes, currently this is contributing to Moutai's success, but this is not a source of risk. What we're actually trying to say in paragraph 7 is that later, Chinese love of liquor-filled celebration may not continue, and if it doesn't continue, then the company will be in a problem, or it will face a problem, sorry. So ultimately, option 2 contributes to the success of the company, but it is not really a source of risk, which is why option 2 cannot be the answer. The third one says it's appeal to the rich. But this again is a contributory factor, right? It contributes to the success of the company. It is not, however, a source of risk. If the rich continue to buy the brand or in the future, then there is no problem at all. It is also not saying anywhere in the passage that in the future people will not be rich. So this is not a risk. Option 4 says government involvement in its business. This was one option that might have tricked some of you. You see, nationalism is one of the reasons that the company has succeeded. But nationalism is not the same as government involvement, right? So when we say government involvement in its business is a possible threat, that is only a threat. It is not a contributory factor to success. Let me say it one more time. Government involvement in the business has been listed in paragraph 6 only as a threat. Government involvement in the business has not contributed to the success of Moutai. And therefore, option 4 cannot be your answer. So, it means that it has to be option 1. This is a question that requires a little bit of thought, but if you do spend time on it, I think it's pretty simple to arrive at the first option. Now, this looks like it's going to be a very lengthy question, but actually it's not. It's fairly simple. In the context of the passage, we can infer that to succeed in the liquor industry in China, a marketing firm must consider all of the following factors affecting the Chinese liquor market except that. So, which of these factors does the marketing firm not really need to think about? Now, think. You're a marketing firm trying to sell liquor in the Chinese market. Which of these things do you need to not pay attention to? Okay, of course, we will refer to the text because it's an except question. The first option says, the government may control the pricing of products. That is true. Paragraph 6 clearly says that the government is its largest shareholder and a meddlesome one. So, when you're selling in China, government interference may pose a risk. So, this is something you do want to keep in mind when marketing or selling liquor in China. So, option 1 is not an exception. Option 2 says the competition for winning over the middle class is very stiff. This, in fact, is something you need to keep in mind. Look at paragraph 4. It says very clearly, in the second sentence here that markets are littered with the corpses of firms that could not compete in the cutthroat battle for Chinese middle class wallets. So there is a lot of competition for the middle class. But in the elite or the higher income class, there isn't as much competition. So option 2 is something that you need to take into account, which means it's not an exception. So let's eliminate it. Third says there are few competitors to meet the demands of high-end liquor consumers. When we say few competitors, it means not many. There are not many competitors to meet the demands of high-end liquor consumers. This is an important fact for me because just like Moutai, if I'm a premium brand, I would definitely look at the high-end consumers and I have a greater likelihood of success because if I'm trying to sell to the middle class, I am probably going to face far more competition. So 3 is a relevant fact for the marketing firm, which means this is not an exception. Option 4 says there is money to be made from marketing to the middle class. This, in fact, has been countered by the passage. Again, paragraph 4, second sentence. Cutthroat battle for Chinese middle class wallets. A lot of companies have failed. So, it means that making money from the middle class in China is a very difficult battle. This is not something that you want to learn from the passage. So, option 4 is an exception because the passage actively counters that, which means we can easily select it as our answer now. Now, this here is a slightly tricky question. The phrase would make it an invention to rival gunpowder has been used in the passage in a sense that is. First of all, you need to understand these options. So, we will of course define each of these options for you and then we will see which of these is applicable to the phrase. So, in paragraph 3, if you notice, when we say it also claims to be hangover proof, which would make it an invention to rival gunpowder. What we're trying to say is that, in fact, if it is hangover proof, then it's fantastic. It is as fantastic and impactful as gunpowder. So it is a comparison with gunpowder, but it's not a direct comparison. It is a comparison in terms of having impact or significance. So let's keep this in mind that this phrase has been used to compare Moutai or whatever liquor it sells to gunpowder because supposedly it is hangover proof, which is obviously an attractive feature. Now the first option says literal. Literal would mean that we have to take this sentence or phrase at face value. Are we actually trying to say that the liquor can rival gunpowder? That instead of gunpowder, I would want to buy liquor? No, not really. So we cannot take this phrase at face value. It is a comparison, but it's not really a direct comparison. All that we're trying to say is that, if it were in fact hangover proof, imagine the impact it would have on the market, right? So it's trying to show us how important this product might be, but definitely not to be taken literally. So let's eliminate it. Synonymical. See, we know what synonyms are. They're words with similar meanings, but obviously we're not implying that somehow Moutai is similar in meaning to gunpowder. Not really. There is no synonym that has been used in this sentence or even in the sentences before. So I think this option is easy to eliminate. Metaphorical. We know that metaphor is some sort of a comparison. It's usually a direct comparison, or it is the use of a symbol to signify something else. So here, clearly we are comparing Moutai to gunpowder. But are we connecting them directly? No, we are just trying to say that, just like gunpowder was a very significant invention of its time, Moutai also seems to be pretty significant if it does not give you a hangover. So this could be our answer. Let's keep it. Substantive. See, when we say something is substantive, it means it is essential or that it's firmly rooted in reality. But we're not trying to say that Moutai is essential for us or that just like gunpowder, Moutai is very essential to us. So we definitely don't want to use substantive, which means that our answer is going to be option 3. This question also requires a little bit of thought, but if you have read the whole passage, then I don't think that it is a problem. In the context of the passage, it is most likely that the author refers to Moutai's marketing strategy as the unholy trinity because. Now, this is a because question, right? So obviously, we'll have to infer from the text. But let's take a look at the text first. See, in paragraph 2, we have already mentioned that Moutai's success is it goes against every Western marketing mantra. Now look at the last sentence. In the Boy Scout world of Western business. Now you have to understand that Boy Scouts have a squeaky clean image. So in the squeaky clean world, apparently, of Western business, it would leave a bad taste in more ways than one. What we're implying is that whatever has contributed to the success of Moutai goes against the principles of Western companies. And therefore, it is unholy because we're not supposed to do these things to promote our companies. In paragraph 6, again, we have kind of repeated the same thing. Moutai has succeeded thanks to nationalism, elitism, and ageism. In other words, not in spite of this unholy trinity. So when we call something an unholy trinity, we basically are saying that they are not desirable. But it has succeeded because of these undesirable marketing practices and not in spite of them. Let's keep this in mind and look at our options. It profits from Chinese nationalist feelings. This is true, but this doesn't address the unholy trinity. This is just one facet of that unholy trinity. So I think it is a partial answer only. Let's eliminate it. Option 2 says it contradicts the Western strategy of marketing. Why are we calling it unholy? Because the West would see it as unholy. That is why we have to connect paragraph 2 and paragraph 6. In the Boy Scout world of Western business, it would leave a bad taste. Moutai has succeeded because of this unholy trinity. So all of these three things are seen as undesirable in the Western world. So yes, it does go against the Western strategy of marketing. Let's keep it. There is nothing holy about marketing techniques for liquor. See, this is a generalization, but the author is not implying that there is no good way to sell liquor, because that would be a little preachy, right? So the author is not saying that, you know what, if you're selling liquor, then you're not doing anything holy in any way. That is not the message. Therefore, option 3 cannot be an answer. Option 4 says it exposes the firm to long-term risks. While that may be true, the unholy trinity is not all responsible for the long-term risks. So again, this may only be a partial answer, and the word unholy does not refer to risk. It refers to the fact that it goes against certain desirable principles of marketing. That is why option 4 cannot be our answer. So option 2 it is. We're looking at a pretty simple summary question here. It's simple because the paragraph is easy to understand and the options are pretty well differentiated. Now, what I normally do when I read is that I mentally subdivide the paragraph into 2 or 3 parts, particularly focusing on any transition words or contrast indicators. Okay. So, for example, as I read this, the first line is simply telling me a fact. Humans have managed to tweak the underlying biology of various plants and animals to produce high-tech crops and microbes. This is something that we have done. Now, I'm not sure whether this is an important point or whether it is not an important point, but I need to make a note of it because this is the introduction of the topic. After that, however, is when I'm going to start paying very close attention because the next sentence starts with but. So this is going to be important. But regulating these entities is complicated as the framework of policies and procedures are outdated and not flexible enough to adapt to emerging technology. So there is a problem with regulating these entities. Number one, the procedures are outdated and they're not flexible enough, right? So I have to make a note of this point. So this becomes my next major point, which we are labeling as Y. The final point here is that the question is whether regulation will ever be able to keep up with human innovation. Now, even if I don't understand the entire sentence, what the author is implying is that yes, we are saying that regulating these entities is complicated. But given the fact that living things are unpredictable and we can't really anticipate all the things that they will bring into the picture, will regulation ever be good enough? So ultimately, the author is leaving us with something to think about. This becomes my final point. So, out of these, what are the 2 points that I definitely want to refer to, Y and Z? I'm not saying we're going to leave X out. If we can include X, great. But even if I don't include X, I will be okay with it because it's just a fact. It's background information. Now, let's take a look at our options. The first option says the mercurial nature of biological entities calls for scientists to shape the regulations governing emerging technology with regular calibration to handle variations in the field. Now, the first word here is mercurial. When I say the first word that will make us doubt this option. See, when you are mercurial, it means that you're pretty unpredictable. So yes, in a way, we are saying that living things are unpredictable. I could probably live with the word mercurial, although it's a little extreme. But the problem with the first option is that it's not taking into account the last point. The author is not merely saying that the current regulation is not good enough. The author is asking us whether it will ever be good enough. Option 1 does not really highlight that aspect. So let's eliminate it. Option 2 says the problem with formulating regulation for innovation in the scientific arena is that it is impossible to imagine the outcomes or risks related to the outcomes of all the research. First of all, we are talking about the biology of plants and animals, right? The unpredictable nature that makes it very difficult to frame regulation is attributed to living things. Now, if you look at option 2, it doesn't mention the living things. Plus, it doesn't deal with point Z at all, because we have to say, because living things are unpredictable, how can we anticipate all the risks? So option 2 also is not good enough. Let's eliminate it. The third one, current regulation of biotechnology is outdated. Now, this is my point Y. But it is debatable if we can create a framework imaginative and flexible to cover all contingencies in this fast changing area. Now, where have we mentioned living things here, you ask? Biotechnology, right? So at least the bio word is there, which means that we are still related, we are relating this point to living things. So we have highlighted the fact that current regulation is not good enough, and we have also raised the question of whether it will ever be good enough. So let's keep option 3. The fourth one says a new framework of rules and procedures for regulating the most recent research emerging from biotechnology is urgently needed. So yes, in a way, from Y, I can possibly say that new regulation is required because the current framework is not good enough. Now let's keep reading. To keep up with this rapidly changing discipline, all that 4 is saying is that we need new regulation, but it does not raise the point that Z raises. Will we ever have regulation that is good enough? Because living things are unpredictable, so the risks cannot really be predicted. So option 4 does not deal with Z, which means we eliminate it. This is why I said that the options are pretty well differentiated. Our answer will have to be option 3. Now, this summary question is a little complicated, primarily on account of the text itself. The text is not very easy to understand. First of all, it talks about lyric poetry. A lot of us may not really understand what lyric poetry is. Secondly, it talks about Marxism, again, something that most of us will find difficult to understand. This paragraph is actually trying to relate poetry to Marxism, which obviously makes things pretty complicated. But if you break it down into bits and pieces, you will be able to see some light in the dark. So let's try and do that. We will try to identify the main points by breaking up this paragraph. And once you do that, the options are not that difficult. It's just this part that is tough. Now, the first sentence says, lyric poetry is a genre of private meditation rather than public commitment. So let's say that I understand only about 50% of it. What it is trying to say is that poetry is a private thing. It's not a public thing, right? So that bit I understand. The impulse in Marxism towards changing a society deemed unacceptable in its basic design would seem to place demands on lyric poetry that would probably not be right. That is how I understand the rest of it. Why is it saying that? You see, lyric poetry deals with the personal rather than public. What does Marxism want? Marxism wants to change the world, right? So, when Marxism wants to change the world because it thinks that the current state of the world is unacceptable, it is placing demands on poetry that lyric poetry cannot fulfill, because the goal of lyric poetry is more private meditation. It is not any commitment to public or world change. So that is what the second part is. Now, if I have understood these two parts, I have my first two main points. First, lyric poetry focuses on personal reflection, not societal commitments. That was our first sentence. Then we talk about Marxism and how it demands societal change, and therefore it kind of seems incompatible with lyric poetry's commitment to the private and the personal. After that, however, comes the clincher. There is within Marxism, however. Now, this point has to be important. Why? Because of the word however. Again, a contrast is being indicated. So, if I don't represent the last part, I will get the answer wrong. This is the author's key point. There is within Marxism, however, also a strand of thought that would locate in lyric poetry alternative modes of perception and description that call forth a vision of world at odds with the repressive reality. Now let's pause here, breathe and think, what did I just read? We're trying to say that, okay, lyric poetry mostly deals with personal reflection, private thoughts, right? But at the same time, if you look at it in a different way, as Marxism does, lyric poetry could also come up with a vision of the world that is contrary to what it really is. Now, let me read out the same words to you. It will call forth a vision of world at odds with a repressive reality, or that draw attention to the workings of ideology within the hegemonic culture. So what are we really trying to say here? We're trying to say that, okay, even if I have private thoughts and I express it in poetry, it could still go against a repressive actual reality. I may not really feel that the world as it is great, and I may express that in my private thoughts. As long as I'm doing that, I am still meeting the demands of Marxism. So that becomes my last point. However, Marxism also sees in lyric poetry a way to challenge dominant ideologies and imagine alternative utopian idealistic realities. So now, I know it was a very complicated paragraph. We started off by saying poetry is private, not public. Marxism wants to change the world and society and so on. So how does it really have anything to do with lyric poetry? But then we said, okay, lyric poetry can be private, but it can still come up with a vision of the world which is idealistic and therefore meet the demands of Marxism. So in a way, yes, there is still a bit of correlation between the two. Having understood the passage, let's take a look at our options. The first option says, the focus of lyric poetry as personal may not seem compatible with Marxism. This is our point X and Y. So far, it is fine. However, it is possible to envisage lyric poetry as a symbol of resistance against an oppressive culture. This is what point Z says. Lyric poetry, even as private thought, can challenge an oppressive culture because personally also I may not be very happy with the world as it is. So option 1 does capture X, Y and Z. Let's keep it. Option 2 says Marxism has internal contradictions due to which one strand of Marxism sees no merit in lyric poetry. First of all, I can stop reading it here because the paragraph does not talk about internal contradictions within Marxism. Also, nowhere is it saying that Marxism sees no merit in lyric poetry. It does. Ultimately, that is the main point that I want to represent. So option 2 cannot be an answer. Option 3 says Marxism makes unreasonable demands on lyric poetry. The moment I read this sentence, I think, okay, nowhere is it saying that these demands are unreasonable. In fact, lyric poetry can meet the demands of Marxism. So option 3 is also gone. Option 4 says the focus of lyric poetry is largely personal, while that of Marxism is bringing change in society. This part I'm very happy with because this is what X and Y are talking about. Let's keep reading. Unless the difference is resolved, poetry will remain largely utopian. But we are not saying that we have to resolve a difference. We are saying ultimately that poetry does meet the demands of Marxism if you look at it in a different way. So we are not asking to resolve differences. That is why option 4 falls flat when you read the second half of it. So our answer will have to be option 1. As I said, the paragraph is difficult, options not so much. So on the whole, I would say this is a moderate question, but one that I think most of us should have gotten right. Now let's take a look at this passage that talks about languages becoming endangered and dying out. So the topic is very easy to figure out the moment you read the first 2 sentences. We're talking about extinction or dying out of languages. As we read, it says that languages die out for many reasons. One of the reasons is that the speakers of that language die out. Sadly, the physical annihilation of communities of native speakers of a language is all too often the cause of language extinction. People die out, therefore the language dies out. In North America, now we're quoting a specific example, European colonists brought death and destruction to many Native American communities. Now, in case you're wondering why are we talking about the Europeans in North America? Well, we have to understand that North America was colonized by the Europeans who were trying to escape Europe due to religious persecution. That is not part of this passage, that is just background information. So, when the Europeans came to America and they wanted to establish a home and a life there, they obviously wanted to get rid of the native population. That is why It brought death and destruction to many Native American communities, the people who were already living there. This was followed by US federal policies restricting the use of indigenous or native languages, including the removal of native children from their communities to federal boarding schools, where native languages and cultural practices were prohibited. Now, if you really think about it, this is very, very sad. First of all, we're trying to kill those people, which is bad in itself. But even when we're not, we are removing the children from their families. We're putting them in some sort of a boarding system where we are saying that you have to become mainstream. You cannot speak your own language and you cannot follow the cultural practices of your community. Now, obviously, if the next generation does not speak the language and has to follow the mainstream culture, then that language and culture will die out. So, we are trying to say that languages die out due to two reasons. One, physical destruction of the people who speak that language, and policies that actually suppress indigenous language and cultures, which is what happened in North America. Now, if you look at the last sentence, it says as many as 75% of the languages spoken in the territories that became the US have gone extinct. So many languages died out, most of us won't even know what those are. With slightly better language survival rates in Central and South America. Well, we might feel a little optimistic about that, but the point is it's only slightly better. Now, let's go to paragraph 2. Even when we do not physically destroy the people who speak those languages, languages can still become endangered due to a completely different reason. The language of the dominant cultures may drive other languages into extinction. For example, let's say that the Europeans came to the US. Now, the Europeans supposedly were more powerful. Supposedly, after a point of time, they were seen as more evolved, at least by themselves. So, in a way, it becomes a dominant culture. But even more than that, it says young people see education, jobs, culture, and technology associated with the dominant language and focus their attention on that language. Of course, we have seen something similar happen in India as well. We see that certain languages get you jobs and certain others not so much. So what happens? We start focusing on that dominant language, as a result of which some of our own languages die out. And it specifically tells you the largest language killers are English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Russian, Hindi, and Chinese, all of which have privileged status as dominant languages. So again, some of us might take offense at certain things stated in the passage, but overall it's trying to say that these languages are privileged. They are the dominant languages in the culture, and because of the benefits that they bring, they kill the other languages which do not bring as many benefits. So let's sum up the argument here. The languages of a dominant culture or privileged languages may drive other languages to extinction, which is what has happened in a lot of cases. Now, in the third and the fourth paragraph, we have moved away from what causes language extinction, and we are looking at the implications of it and what can be done about it. So we are moving in a slightly different direction. Paragraph 3 says what happens when we lose a language. We lose the worldview, culture, and the knowledge of the people who spoke it, constituting a loss to all humanity. Now let's understand this. In certain languages, say, there are certain expressions or words which are not there in other languages. Why does that happen? Because perhaps that culture sees the world a little bit differently from other cultures. Now, when we lose that language, we also lose the ability to see the world from that point of view. And this is a loss to humanity as a whole. At least that is what the author is arguing. People around the world live in direct contact with their native environment, their habitat. When the language they speak goes extinct, the rest of humanity loses their knowledge of that environment, their wisdom about the relationship between local plants and illnesses, their philosophical and religious beliefs, and so on. So it's kind of building on that argument. So whichever people live in a particular area, and they're obviously well familiar with the area, they are familiar with all the diseases that are prevalent, they're also familiar with all the plants that can possibly cure those diseases. Now, when we lose sight of the language and the culture of that civilization, we might also lose that essential knowledge. So when, as a foreigner, I go into that territory, I don't have that knowledge that this culture had for eons probably. So that is what paragraph 3 is trying to establish, that losing a language is a loss to humanity. Now, obviously, we need to do something about that. Now, in paragraph 4, we are talking about what we can do about this situation. Liberal arts is the way to go. As educators deeply immersed in the liberal arts, we believe that educating students broadly in all facets of language and culture yields immense rewards. Effectively, we need to get students to learn about these different languages. Now, some of these students, perhaps some extraordinary ones, will pursue advanced study in linguistics. They become actively engaged in preserving languages, and then it gives you an example of how they might actually make efforts to preserve a language that might go extinct. So overall, we are talking about what loss of a language means. It is equal to loss of culture, knowledge, and worldview of the people who spoke that language, and the fact that liberal arts education might actually inspire people to preserve endangered languages. So far, so good. Now let's look at paragraph 5. Now in paragraph 5, the author acknowledges the fact that the vast majority of students will not pursue this kind of activity. Because obviously it's a little far-fetched, right? How many of us would actually want to go to the Amazon and try to preserve an endangered language despite what we have studied? So the author is saying, yes, I understand, I'm being practical. For these students, a liberal arts education is absolutely critical from the twin perspectives of language extinction and global citizenship. Now, let's say I don't understand this line. It's okay, because the author is explaining what happens when you have a liberal arts education which is grounded in linguistics. When students study languages other than their own, they are sensitized to the existence of different cultural perspectives. Now, if some of you have tried to learn a foreign language, you'll understand what I'm talking about, or at least what this article is talking about. Let's say you were trying to learn Japanese or Korean, which seem to be pretty popular languages right now. You're not only learning the language, you're also learning a lot about that culture through that language. With such an education, students are more likely to be able to articulate insights into their own cultural biases. Now, when you start learning about another culture, you will see how that culture is somewhat different from your own. And because of that, you might be able to also realize that you were slightly biased, that you had certain thoughts about that culture which are probably not justified. Be more empathetic to individuals of other cultures. Why? Because now you're slightly more familiar with that culture. Communicate successfully across linguistic and cultural differences. So if you have learned another language, it is no longer a barrier. You'll be able to communicate with those people as if you know them. Consider and resolve questions in a way that reflects multiple cultural perspectives and ultimately support the preservation of endangered languages. So ultimately, if you learn another language or multiple languages, it yields a lot of benefits. And how does this come through? Liberal arts education. Paragraph 6 is saying that there is ample evidence that such preservation can work in languages spiraling towards extinction. So it gives you an example of how preservation efforts might actually work. Overall, paragraph 5 and 6 are trying to say that a liberal arts education can foster cultural awareness, empathy, sensitivity, and support for endangered languages, which might actually preserve some of them. So now we've understood the whole passage. Let's do a very quick recap. So in the first paragraph, we explained how languages die out primarily due to physical destruction of the people who speak that language or policies that discourage the use of that language. Then we said that even when this doesn't happen, the dominant language in a particular region or a country may kill the non-dominant languages, and it named certain language killers. Then we talked about how the loss of a language is actually loss of culture, knowledge, and worldview, and obviously this is bad, and liberal arts education can actually help to preserve some languages. Then we went further in that argument saying how a liberal arts education might actually help. It can foster cultural awareness, empathy, support for endangered languages, and it could also inspire preservation efforts. Again, remember that the author is not saying everyone educated in the liberal arts is going to try and preserve languages, but it might help you or inspire you to do that. And then it ended by saying that there are some efforts that are underway and they have been successful. So the author's main argument here is how liberal arts, which is somehow related to linguistics, plays an important role in supporting and preserving languages that might otherwise go extinct. So this is what we need to keep in mind when we answer the argument-based questions. Let's take a look at our first question from this passage. Now, this looks complicated, but actually it's not. In the context of the passage, which one of the following hypothetical scenarios, if true, is not an example of the kind of loss that occurs when a language becomes extinct, which is not a loss due to loss of a language. Okay. Now, paragraph 3 gives us the details for what happens when we lose a language, right? We lose the worldview, culture, knowledge of the people who spoke it, which is a loss to all of humanity, right? So let's keep this in mind when we evaluate our options. This is in fact an application-based question, which means that the options will not be given to you in the text. You have to understand the author's argument and you have to extend it or apply it to a completely new situation. Option 1 says that the Inuits of Alaska have 35 different words to describe the texture of snow. When the language becomes extinct, we will lose that understanding of nature. That's exactly what paragraph 3 also talks about. When we lose a language, we will also lose the knowledge of the people who spoke it. And these are the people who are closely in touch with their natural environment and understand it better than an outsider. So when the language goes, that knowledge also goes. So option 1 is an example of the kind of loss that occurs when we lose a language. Since we are looking for something that is not an example, let's eliminate the first option. The second one, the Andamanese language has a word to describe someone who has lost a stepsister. Now, if you think about it, I don't think all the languages have this kind of word. This is very, very specific. When the language dies, we will lose the concept of the word and the emotions it evokes. So, this language has a very specific word for a very specific kind of loss. Now, let's say if we've never really experienced that loss, or we don't really think that kind of loss is different from other kinds of losses, we will simply never know. So when the Andamanese language goes extinct, we will also lose that worldview, which is exactly what paragraph 3 is also saying. When we lose a language, we lose the worldview and the knowledge of the people who speak it. So option 2 cannot be our answer. Third says, the Lamkangs of Manipur have only 3 remaining native speakers of the language. When they die, we will lose one more group from the government list of indigenous tribes. Effectively, we are losing a tribe. Why? Because there are only 3 people remaining who speak that language. However, this is not a loss due to the language of the kind that paragraph 3 describes. Yes, it is a loss because we are losing a tribe, right? But have we lost knowledge or worldview or culture according to option 3? No. Option 3 does not describe loss of knowledge, culture, or worldview. It only says we will lose a tribe from the government list. So, even though it is a loss, it is not the kind of loss that the passage talks about, which means 3 can be our answer. The fourth one says the Nicobarese language describes 20 different moods of the ocean. By the time the last speaker is educated in a central board school, they will have forgotten their language. So yes, this is also a way for language to go extinct. And what are we losing in this case? The 20 different moods of the ocean. Again, if we do not know that there are actually 20 words, how will we ever understand that the ocean has 20 moods? So this is another loss due to loss of language. So option 4 cannot be our answer. Ultimately, we go back to option 3. We're not losing knowledge, culture, or worldview here. We are only losing a tribe from a specified governmental list. That is why option 3 is our answer. Now, this question says, it can be inferred from the passage that it is likely South America had a slightly better language survival rate than North America for all of the following reasons except. The first paragraph does tell us that in North America, 75% of the native languages went extinct, right? And the survival rates in South and Central America were better. But what were the reasons? So we are going into the inference territory. Remember, whenever you do derive an inference, you still need to find support in the passage. The first option says the colonial government was unable to mainstream the locals. Now let's look at what happened in North America. In North America, first of all, they tried to kill off a lot of the Native Americans. So that is physical destruction of the people. Option 1 is not talking about physical destruction, but look at what else they did. This was followed by US federal policies restricting the use of indigenous languages, including removal of native children from their communities to federal boarding schools. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to mainstream these communities by getting the children to forget their language and culture. Now, this question is asking us, what is the reason probably that so many languages or as many languages were not lost in South America? since in South America, the colonial government was not or unable to mainstream the locals, perhaps they were able to preserve some of their native languages. So how are we doing it? We're simply trying to draw a contrast between what happened in North America and what did not happen in South America. So if this happened in North America but did not happen in South America, this could be a reason for why languages were preserved. So this is not an exception. Let's eliminate it. The second one, not many native speakers were killed by European colonists. Now, in North America, it clearly tells you that European colonists brought death and destruction to many Native American communities, and it is quoting this as a major reason for language extinction. So, if this did not happen in South America, this could have been one of the reasons why not as many languages died out there. Again, not an exception. The third option says European colonists allowed the children of Native American native speakers to stay at home with their families. Again, this is something that was done in North America as a way to suppress native languages and cultures. If this was not done in South America, it might have led to the preservation of some native languages. So this is not an exception. Now, let's take a look at option 4. Locals were provided job opportunities in the colonial administration. The way that I look at it, this is not really a contrast between North America and South America. So in any case, I am inclined towards this answer. Now, let's also think about it in another way. In South America, if locals were provided job opportunities in the colonial administration, do we really know whether it helps the survival of native languages or whether it in fact does away with them? We really don't know the impact on the native languages either way. So option 4 is an exception. We cannot say that this contributed to the survival of languages in South America, which is why this is an exception. So we mark option 4 as our answer. Now here we are saying the author believes that a liberal arts education combined with participation in language preservation empowers students in all of the following ways except. Now the way that I understand this question is, I have to look for something that liberal arts education will not really empower students to do. Okay, so what are the special skills that they will not get or something that is not mentioned in the passage? Let's take a look. Now in paragraph 5, we have detailed all the things that liberal arts education with participation in language preservation might do for students. These students will probably get sensitized to the existence of other cultural perspectives. They are going to have insights into their own cultural biases and so on. So multiple benefits have been mentioned. We just need to look for something that has not been mentioned as a benefit. Okay. So the first option says learn different languages. This is something that they will most likely do because paragraph 5 clearly says when students study languages other than their own. So yes, they will learn other languages and therefore it will be empowerment or benefit. So this is not an exception. Option 2 says overcome cultural barriers to communication. Now, the same paragraph clearly tells you that they will be able to communicate successfully across linguistic and cultural differences. So they will be able to overcome cultural barriers to communication. Clearly mentioned. So this is also a benefit that the student will derive, not an exception. Third one, develop a better understanding of their own culture. Now, this is the part where it says, with such an education, students are more likely to be able to articulate insights into their own cultural biases. So this will help them understand their own culture better, perhaps from the perspective of what biases it has, but it is still gaining a better understanding. So this is also a way that the student will benefit. Now, the fourth option says, establish schools to preserve languages spiraling towards extinction. I know that the passage does mention such efforts, but it does not say that a liberal arts education will get students to make that kind of effort. In fact, the beginning of paragraph 5 says, certainly though, the vast majority of students will not pursue this kind of activity. They will not actively go and devote their lives to preserving a language, but it will still benefit them in other ways. That is what paragraph 5 is saying. So, nowhere are we trying to imply that a liberal arts education will get students to establish schools to preserve languages. Some of them might, but most of them will not. Also, this is not really a way that the student will be empowered. This is not necessarily a benefit to the student. This is just something that they will do if they choose to do it to preserve an endangered language. So, regardless of how we look at it, option 4 is not a way to empower the student, Plus, the author does not say that a liberal arts education will definitely get students to do it. So, our answer is option 4. Now, this question is slightly tricky because the moment it starts talking about hypothetical scenarios, we need to start thinking, okay, this is an application question, which means I have to use logic. Which one of the following hypothetical scenarios, if true, would most strongly undermine or weaken the central ideas of the passage? So, this is a weaken the argument question. Now, we do need to keep in mind what the central idea was. Thankfully, we have it right here. Educating students in all facets of language through the liberal arts plays an important role in supporting and preserving endangered languages. So, the author is all for the liberal arts. Now, we have to undermine the central ideas of the passage. So, we probably have to pick something that will go against this idea. But we can also refer to specific text as and when required. The first option says, recording a dying language that has only a few remaining speakers freezes it in time, it stops evolving further. Now, is this really going against the author's central idea? No. The author is trying to say that encouraging liberal arts education could help the preservation of endangered languages. The author does not say that the language has to evolve or that if you simply record a few speakers speaking the language, it is not going to help. So the point is that while option 1 may be true, it does not weaken the central idea. It does not say anything about how liberal arts may or may not help the preservation of languages. So as far as I know, it has no impact on the argument. But let's look at it closely. See, in paragraph 4, the author has said that some individuals who pursue liberal arts may actually become actively engaged in language preservation. But even here, the example that has been taken is exactly what option 1 talks about. To interview the last surviving elders in a community to record and document a language spoken by no children. So ultimately, yes, they are just preserving a record of that language. The author is not necessarily arguing for evolution of that language anywhere. Now, option 1 is not our answer. Option 2 says most liberal arts students will pursue jobs in publishing and human resource management rather than doctorates in linguistics. Now, this is a trap option. But let's look at what the author has said in paragraph 5. Here, when the author says certainly the vast majority of students will not pursue this kind of activity, there is acknowledgement that yes, we can educate them in the liberal arts, but it doesn't mean everyone will devote their lives to preserving endangered languages. Still, there will be benefits. That is what paragraph 5 is saying. So, even if option 2 is true, as it is acknowledged in paragraph 5, it does not defeat the author's argument. Even if they pursue jobs in completely different spheres, they will still derive the benefits of that liberal arts education. For example, they will be sensitized to the existence of different cultural practices and perspectives, which for the author is still pretty good. So, option 2 does not weaken the argument. Option 3 says a liberal arts education requires that in addition to being fluent in English, which if you remember was one of the global language killers, students gain fluency in 2 of the top 5 most spoken languages globally. Are these the languages that students really need to focus on? No. If option 3 is true, then the author's entire argument for liberal arts gets defeated. Because liberal arts students are going to focus on the dominant languages anyway. If they're focusing on dominant languages, there will be absolutely no orientation to the endangered languages. So, the author's argument that liberal arts education can help preserve other worldviews or may lead to cultural sensitivity or preservation of endangered languages, that argument gets finished. So, option 3 probably could be our answer. Let's keep it. Option 4 says the schools that teach endangered languages can preserve the language only for a generation. Again, the author is not arguing that the languages have to be preserved for an eternity. All that the author is saying, let's try liberal arts education, maybe it will help. Also, if you look at option 4, it's not really talking about how liberal arts may or may not help the preservation of languages. It only talks about the schools. So it doesn't have any impact on the language preservation anyway, which means that option 3 will have to be our answer. This one is slightly tough because it requires some thought, and in any case, we know that weaken the argument questions can be tricky. But I think the only thing I would hold against this question is that it might be time consuming. If you had the time, then it's not very difficult. Now, we finally have a passage on AI, because how could we not? In this passage, there is one question which is slightly controversial. When we get to it, I will explain the controversy. But for now, let's just read the passage and try our best to understand it, because honestly, it's not very complicated. So we've said that we've always been afraid of AI, but there is a new fear now because of a particular ability that AI has gained. AI has gained some remarkable abilities to manipulate and generate language, whether with words, sounds, or images. AI has thereby hacked the operating system of our civilization. This last line is pretty important, but I think let's focus on the topic first. We are talking about how the language abilities of AI has consequences for human civilization. And the author is trying to say that because AI has gained this new ability, it poses a new unexpected threat to the human civilization. The last line is telling us that language is pretty important to our civilization, and the passage devotes quite some time to explaining how. So let's take a look at paragraph 2. Language is the stuff almost all human culture is made of. Human rights, for example, aren't inscribed in our DNA. Rather, they are cultural artifacts. Artifact is some sort of a man-made object we created by telling stories and writing laws. Gods aren't physical realities. Rather, they are cultural artifacts we created by inventing myths and writing scriptures. So, language is what human culture is made of. If not for these stories and myths, a large chunk of our culture would be simply non-existent. What would happen once a non-human intelligence becomes better than the average human at telling stories, composing melodies, drawing images, writing laws and scriptures? Basically, all the stuff that humans do to pass on culture. What if AI takes over all of that? When people think about ChatGPT and other new AI tools, they're often drawn to examples like school children using AI to write their essays. And the author is saying, yes, I mean, we can think about that, but then you're missing out on the big picture. The consequences are far worse. Think of the next American presidential race in 2024. Try to imagine the impact of AI tools that can be made to mass produce political content, fake news stories, and scriptures for new cults. For all we know, that might already have happened and we wouldn't even know it. But the author is trying to tell us that once AI hacks language, it is also going to be able to influence so many aspects of our culture, particularly politics and media. So, if I have to sum up the argument, we are saying that the advanced capabilities of AI can have a far-reaching impact on human society, particularly politics and media. Now here, ChatGPT has been mentioned, but let's remember that while our concerns are about how children and students are using ChatGPT, the author is not really highlighting that as a major concern. It's saying there is a lot worse that we need to think about. Now, let's take a look at paragraph 3 and 4. Through its mastery of language, AI could even form intimate relationships with people. Now think about it. What really draws us to other people? Sometimes it's the way they look, but what if they do not say the right things to us? Then automatically we will not like them. So, if AI can figure out what are the words that it can use to generate intimacy or closeness with another human being, then it can pretty much take over our lives. It can manipulate our emotions. It can change our opinions and our worldviews because, of course, we are influenced by people that we are close to. There is no indication that AI has any consciousness or feelings of its own. To foster fake intimacy with humans, it is enough if AI can make them feel emotionally attached to it. So, AI does not have to be a real person with real feelings. But since we have feelings, AI can always manipulate our emotions to its own goals or agenda, whatever they may be. Paragraph 4 says, what will happen to the course of history when AI takes over culture and begins producing stories, melodies, laws, and religions? Now, when we think about past innovations, let's say the printing press or the radio, this is also a way to spread culture, right? But there is a major difference. The radio or the TV or the newspaper even does not really generate content on its own. It is a human that produces that content, which is then shared by these media. But AI is a completely different being here. AI can create completely new ideas without any help from a human being, completely new culture. Of course, the new power of AI could be used for good purposes as well, but the author is saying there are enough people talking about what good AI can do, so let's not go there. So again, the author is trying to highlight the implications of AI once it is able to manipulate language. Number one, it could start forging close personal relationships with people and start influencing their emotions and changing their views. And it could also create a new culture all by itself. Now, paragraph 5 says that we can regulate the new AI tools, but we have to act quickly. So finally, the author is calling for action. We need regulation and we need it fast. But there is one tiny thing which is very, very important. I would suggest to make it mandatory for AI to disclose that it is an AI. Now think about it. Let's say that you're chatting with someone on text, on a computer, through email. What if they tell you that they are AI? Would we interpret those messages differently? Yes, we would. But the same thing, if we feel is being done by a human, then that's a completely different game. So the AI disclosing that it is AI might help. If I'm having a conversation with someone and I cannot tell whether it is a human or an AI, that's the end of democracy. Why? Because democracy is based on conversations between people. And if AI can kind of manipulate that conversation, then that is the end of democracy. Then anyone can misuse that access to do whatever they want with the government and the world itself. So, overall, the author is trying to say that AI and its linguistic capabilities have far-reaching impact. Specifically here, the author is trying to say that it can undermine democracy because democracy is based on conversations between humans. And to prevent this, we need to make sure that there is at least one regulation in place immediately that AI should disclose that it is AI. So that's it. That's what the passage is about. Let's do a very quick recap. In the first paragraph, we highlighted how there is a new threat from AI. Recent advancements in AI's ability to manipulate and generate language is a threat to our culture and civilization, which was not foreseen earlier. AI's advanced capabilities in creating cultural content can impact our society, particularly politics and media. That is why it mentions the American elections. Then we said that if AI can manipulate language and create new cultural ideas, it can influence emotions, it can get close to people, it can shape opinions, it can also create entirely new cultures. And finally, we said that unregulated AI can disrupt democracy, and we need to make sure that we put at least one regulation in place, apart from others, that it should disclose its identity. So when content is generated, the AI should disclose that it is generated by an AI. So the main point of the passage, what is the common thread? Yes, we are talking about the linguistic capabilities of AI and the impact that it will have. But there is a very clear political thread throughout. If you look at the second paragraph, it talks about the American elections and how AI could possibly manipulate the results by creating fake content or maybe content that is not entirely correct. The third one again talks about how it can influence emotions, shape opinions, which again could influence our views on political candidates and the political process, for example. And the last one clearly talks about how it could impact or rather disrupt democracy. So overall, the author is trying to say that AI's ability with language threatens culture and democracy, and this requires urgent regulation. So that's it. There is a call to action in the end. Now, let's take a look at our first question from this passage. Now, this first question says, the author terms language the operating system of our civilization for all the following reasons except that it. Now, it's an except question, so obviously we'll have to try and trace back each option to the text when in doubt. Our first option says, has laid the foundation for the creation of cultural artifacts through writing and telling of stories. So yes, language does form the basis of culture because a lot of these cultural artifacts such as human rights, God, all of these have been created and communicated by language or through language, stories and myths. So yes, this is one reason that the author has stated very clearly to support the idea that language is important to our civilization. That is how our civilization operates. Remember, we're looking for an exception, so option 1 gets eliminated. The second one says, can influence political views and opinions as it engenders close emotional ties among people. Now, close emotional ties among people, how does it do that? What would happen once a non-human intelligence becomes better than the average human at telling stories, composing melodies, drawing images, and writing laws and scriptures? So, one of the bases for cultural cohesiveness is these stories that we have in common. We feel closer to other human beings because we share a common culture. Now, imagine that AI is now creating or manipulating that culture. What will that do? That can get different groups of people together. But look at the next part. Think of the next American presidential race in 2024. Imagine the impact of AI tools that can mass produce political content, fake news stories, and scriptures for new cults. What is a cult? It is a group of people with a fixed set of beliefs. And usually we call it a cult because they're pretty close and they don't really let outsiders in, right? So, if AI can foster the creation of new cults and it can influence political views and opinions, then yes, it is influencing our civilization. So option 2 is not an exception. The third says, it is fundamental to the articulation and spread of human values and culture. Again, we go back to paragraph 2. When it talks about human rights, what are human rights? It is a set of values that we believe in. These are basic rights that we believe all humans should be given. Now, who has created these rights? We ourselves, and we have communicated and popularized them through communication. So yes, language is fundamental to the articulation and spread of human values, such as divinity, human rights, and so on. So option 3 is also not an exception. Option 4 says it is the basis of AI tools like ChatGPT. Now, let me just pause here and say that yes, language obviously is the basis of AI tools like ChatGPT. But is ChatGPT in any way fundamental to our culture? Not really. In fact, even when the author has referred to ChatGPT, he said that a lot of us are worried about students doing their assignments through ChatGPT, but they're missing out on the big picture. So ChatGPT, as an example, also has been relegated to the less important aspects of the passage, which means that ChatGPT is not really a reason for the author saying that language is an operating system of our civilization. This is a completely different example which has been mentioned by the by and then also relegated to the sidelines. So option 4 finally is the exception. Now, in this question, if you got confused, I think the best way to reach your answer is through option elimination. Everything else has been implied except for the fourth one. Now we have a question on tone. So slot 3 was very particular for this. There were in fact a total of 2 questions on tone, which we didn't really see in the other slots. On the whole, I would say tone questions are also vocabulary questions. So here also it is very important for you to understand the words used in the options. Otherwise, this is a challenging question if you don't understand them. So what we'll do is that we'll take a look at the passage recap and the main idea. And as and when required, we will refer to these points to figure out what the author's tone is. Now, the first tone is prescient. Again, we need to know what prescient means. Prescient means the ability to foresee the future. So, is the author really talking about what can happen in the future? Yes. But that is not the only thing that the author is doing. So, the author does analyze the future impact of the use of new AI tools, but the author is also trying to point to the negative aspects of this happening. So when I say that the tone of the passage is prescient, it does not really capture the negative implications that the author is highlighting, which is why option 1 should ideally not be our answer. But if you feel that, I'll keep it on hold, then you can do that as well. The second one says alarmist. Now, alarmist means someone who tries to excite unnecessary fear or alarm. But the author is not trying to say the world is going to come to an end. The author is merely saying that we've always been scared of AI, but now there is a new kind of threat. And at the same time, none of the fears in the passage seem to be exaggerated. So we cannot say that the author's tone is alarmist. This is going to the other side, too negative. So the first one was not negative at all, which is why I didn't think it was the answer, but we've kept it on hold until we find a better option. But when you say alarmist, it basically means that the author has completely crossed over into the other direction and is unnecessarily trying to stir up fear and trouble, which again is not happening because the author has used logical arguments and so on. So this option we should be able to eliminate. Quizzical. See, when you are quizzical, you're kind of confused, as the word suggests. Quiz, right? So the author is not really questioning or doubting. Yes, there are quite a few questions that the author has asked, but they are more of thought-provoking rhetorical questions. But the author is not confused. So we cannot pick option 3 as our answer. Now, the fourth option says cautionary. Now, between prescient and cautionary, what is the difference? Prescient simply means that I am talking about the future and all the things that are happening there. Cautionary means that yes, I am talking about what may happen and I'm also asking you to be careful. And that is something that the author has definitely highlighted in the end. Look at the last point in the passage recap. Unregulated AI could undermine democracy and we need regulation. So the author is cautioning us that we need to take certain steps. Therefore, now we can definitely say option 1 is not the answer and say option 4 is definitely the answer because the author has highlighted the adverse effects of this new generative AI, and it is also trying to say that we need to stop certain things from happening, and therefore cautionary works. Now, this question is actually pretty easy because it's very easy to eliminate options. We can infer that the author is most likely to agree with which of the following. So let's take a look. The only way you could have gone wrong here is if you did not understand the passage or did not refer back to the passage when in doubt. The first option says one of the biggest casualties from the spread of unregulated AI is likely to be the democratic process. Well, in paragraph 5, it clearly says unregulated AI deployments would create social chaos which would benefit autocrats and ruin democracies. The author has consistently talked about what AI can do to the political process. So, the author would agree that the democratic process is likely to be a casualty of unregulated AI. So, we should keep this because it has clear support. The second option says, apart from its drawbacks, AI tools have been beneficial in boosting technological and industrial advance worldwide. I think this is pretty easy to eliminate because the author has not really focused on the benefits of AI. In fact, in paragraph 4, the author has said, I won't dwell on how AI can be used for good. So the author is not really focusing on this bit. Let's eliminate option 2. Option 3 says people's fears of the dangers of students using ChatGPT and other new AI tools are unfounded. Unfounded means that there is no basis, they're not justified. But look at where paragraph 2 has mentioned ChatGPT. It says that when people think about ChatGPT, they are often drawn to examples like school children using AI to write their essays. But has the author said that this is not a valid or a justified concern? No. The author is only trying to say this kind of question misses the big picture. So we are not saying they're unfounded. We are just saying that there are bigger fish that we need to look at. So the word unfounded is why we need to eliminate option 3. Option 4, very similar. The commonly expressed fear that future AI developments will fatally harm humans is unfounded. Not really. If you look at the first paragraph, all that we have said is that so far we have thought that machines are going to kill us. But now there is another way in which AI can harm us. But nowhere is the author saying that fatal harm is not going to happen or that fear is unjustified. So again, because of the word unfounded, we should eliminate the fourth option. So our answer will have to be the first one. Now, we finally have the controversial question. The reason it's controversial is that there are two possible options and it's a little difficult to pick between them. So, in fact, we have also challenged this question on behalf of the students. We'll find out what happens. So, as of now, let me try to explain why the official answer is the answer, but I will also admit that there is some degree of ambiguity here. The author identifies all of the following as dire outcomes of the capture of language by AI, except that it could. So, which of these has not been identified as a dire or a serious outcome of the capture of language by AI, right? So, we're looking for an exception. The first option says, it could outstrip human creativity and endeavors in spheres such as art and music and in the formulation of laws. Now, if we refer to paragraph 2, it does say what will happen if a non-human intelligence becomes better than the human at telling stories, composing melodies, drawing images, writing laws and scriptures. So yes, we have said that this is a possibility. But then, it doesn't necessarily say that this is a dire outcome on its own. So what we would probably say here is that, yes, option 1 has been mentioned, but at the same time, AI simply becoming better than the human in these fields has not on its own been said to be a bad thing. It is the implications of that might be bad. So let's keep option 1 on hold. Now, option 2 says, spawn a completely new culture through its ability to create new ideas and opinions. Now, if AI can create completely new ideas and completely new culture, it basically means that the culture is no longer human, right? It is an AI spawned culture. And this, in fact, is directly mentioned as a bad thing. So, option 2 is not an exception. Similarly, option 3, eventually subvert democratic processes through mass creation and spread of fake political content and news. When we look at this option, clearly we would agree that this is a dire consequence. And if you look at paragraph 2, it does clearly say, think of what AI can do for the next American presidential race. And again, in the last paragraph, the author has said that if AI takes over language and culture, then it will definitely lead to ruin of democracy. So option 3 is in fact a dire consequence, cannot be our answer. Now, option 4, this by the way is the official answer. Applied mastery of language to create strong emotional ties which could exacerbate, worsen the polarization of political views. Now, why is there a problem with this option? Paragraph 3 talks about mastery of language which can be used to form intimate relationships. So far, it's fine. But does it say that this power of intimacy could worsen the polarization of political views? Polarization means that people are opposed to each other and are moving to extremes. So it does not really say that it will further drive people to extreme opinions. So again, just like option 1, option 4 is a bit in the gray zone because of the last part. However, apparently this is the official answer, and if I really think about it, it could be the answer because polarization of political views has not been mentioned. But at the same time, nearly all of the rest of the language is there. Paragraph 3 also says that AI could use the power of intimacy to change our opinions and worldviews. So is changing opinions and worldviews equal to polarization of views? This is where the ambiguity lies. Now, let's look at option 1 again. We have mentioned that AI could outstrip human creativity and endeavors in such spheres. But the reason that we are saying that it could be a better answer is that this itself is not necessarily a dire consequence. So ultimately, since the official answer is 4, let's eliminate option 1 and say that 4 is the answer. Now, at this juncture, you may agree with the official answer or disagree. That's entirely your call. Now here, we're looking at a para-completion question. There's a sentence that is missing in the paragraph below. Look at the paragraph and decide in which blank the following sentence would best fit. I think this is a pretty easy para-completion question, so I hope that you did give it a shot. The given sentence is telling us this reality is putting stress on employees who have to pay for transport, desk lunches, more childcare, clothing, and so on. Costs that they haven't incurred for nearly 2 years. Now, obviously, when I say this reality, I know that it cannot be my starter sentence. So, when we evaluate option 1, we can definitely cancel out option 1 as a possibility because of this reality. This is obviously a follower sentence. So, I think this part is pretty simple. Now, let's go to the next blank. If you notice in the paragraph, it is labeled as number 2, but it was numerically perhaps a different option for you. So, for example, in this case, it was labeled as choice 3, but it was called option 2. Now, what you would notice is that the sentence before and after the blank are logically connected because of the word yet. Prices have risen, yet wages have not kept up with inflation. So that means that there is no logical gap, which means that this definitely is not going to be my answer. After that, we need to look at blank 3 carefully. Why? Because before this, we have mentioned 2 facts. Prices are rising, yet wages have not kept up with the inflation. Now, can we put in the given sentence after this? Yes, perhaps we can. Again, it's just a possibility. Because prices are rising and wages are not keeping up, this reality is putting stress on employees because they have to pay for so many things that they did not have to pay for during the pandemic, the 2 years. So option 3 is a definite candidate. But again, when I say option 3, numerically it would have been indicated perhaps as a different choice, which in this case is actually choice 4. So let's keep option 3 going. After option 3, this is specially jarring for workers who are able to save during remote work. Now, when I say this is specially jarring, it means I'm highlighting a particular group of employees who find this fact a lot more difficult to deal with. So even in this way, the given sentence should be put into option 3 or blank 3 in the paragraph. Now let's move on. After that, what we have mentioned in the last sentence is that in April 2022, a London University lecturer told BBC WorkLife that they were spending nearly a quarter of what they made every day on return to work costs. Now, this sentence is a specific example of how people were able to save certain expenditures during remote work, but now that they have to go back to work, they actually have to spend more. So again, the sentence before and after blank 4 are in fact directly connected, which means that blank 4, which in this case is numerically choice 2, cannot be our answer. So ultimately, we go back and we say that option 3 is going to be our answer. Option 3 according to the paragraph, and for some of you, option 3 could have been a completely different number in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4. So in this case, option 3 is choice 4, therefore choice 4 option 3 is our answer. Now, let's take a look at this para-completion question. I thought this was slightly more difficult to answer because there were multiple places that we could have put this given sentence. Now, what is the given sentence? Taken outside the village of Trang Bang on June 8, 1972, the picture captured the trauma and indiscriminate violence of a conflict that claimed a lot of lives. So, we are clearly talking about some sort of a photograph. Now, when we read the passage, it starts off talking about the horrifying photograph. The first sentence says the horrifying photograph of children fleeing a deadly napalm attack has become a defining image not only of the Vietnam War, but the 20th century. Now, let's think. Could we put the given sentence in blank 1? It seems like we could, because the given sentence is also talking about the same photograph and how it has claimed this particular incident claimed so many lives. But we always try to connect the sentences before and after the blank. Now look at the sentence after the blank. Dark smoke billowing behind them, the young subjects' faces are painted with a mixture of terror, pain and confusion. This is where you need to think. When we say them and the young subjects, we are talking about the children that have been mentioned in the very first sentence. So again, there is a direct connection between the two sentences before and after the blank, which means that option 1 cannot be our answer. Again, numerically, option 1 could have been presented as choice 2. So this is not our answer, so we cross it out. Let's go to the next blank as given in the paragraph. Dark smoke billowing behind them, the young subjects' faces are painted with a mixture of terror, pain and confusion. Soldiers from the South Vietnamese Army's 25th Division follow helplessly behind. So we're still talking about what the picture displays. When we say that the soldiers follow helplessly behind whom? The children. Which means that we are still talking about the contents of the picture. Therefore, this blank needs to remain blank. There is nothing that we should put here. Moving on to the third blank in the paragraph, which again numerically could be a completely different choice. The picture was officially titled The Terror of War. Now, if we take the given sentence, it talks about how the picture captured the trauma and indiscriminate violence of a conflict that captured so many lives. The picture was officially titled The Terror of War. Now, the given sentence is actually justifying this title, which means that blank 3 in the paragraph, which in this case is actually presented as choice 4, could be our answer, which means let's not cancel it out. Now, let's talk about the last blank, blank 4 in the paragraph, which in this case is numerically choice 3. After we have talked about the 9-year-old at the center of the picture, the sentence after that should probably talk about this 9-year-old child or provide some more details about the napalm girl. But the given sentence does not do that. The given sentence generally talks about what the picture represents. So the fourth blank does not really seem to be the best choice. Let's cancel it out. So ultimately, our answer has to be blank 3 in the paragraph, which in fact numerically is option 4.